Many English majors want to be writers. While most of them have more talent than the self-discipline to actually write, it is up to the faculty in the creative writing program to help students, both English majors and non-majors, discover the talent and determine if the self-discipline is there. Although I have never taught creative writing, I know well the challenges of developing the program and of teaching the individual courses. Such a program requires more than offering courses. It involves setting up readings, directing workshops, organizing writers' conferences, and working individually with the students who have both the talent and the discipline. That is one reason I know why we at Berry are so fortunate to have Sandy Meek to direct our program in creative writing. I have been doubly fortunate because not only have I now had the opportunity to work with Sandy, but also I have worked with our two writers who are reading tonight. I first met Josh McKinney, now a member of the English faculty at California State University in Sacramento, in December 1992. We were sitting in a hotel room in New York at the annual meeting of the Modern Language Association. Valdosta State University was interviewing for someone to help build a creative writing program which was struggling for survival, and Josh was looking for a tenure-track position. Actually, I can still remember the interview. Pat Miller, my English colleague from VSU, and I were tired from many interviews, and Josh, wearing an earring which disappeared before he arrived in Valdosta, was, I suspect, a little nervous about another interview. But Pat and I recognized then what was later confirmed, that Josh had the talent, the drive, the commitment, and the political skills to transform our program into one which truly served the students and department at VSU. It was not an easy assignment, because as a young, untenured assistant professor, he was being asked to come into an established situation which wasn't really working and turn it around. It required a great deal from one so young. But Josh tackled the assignment with energy and integrity. Before he was tenured and promoted, he had established a structure for the program, begun to recruit students into the courses, helped to revitalize the student literary journal, built a place within the English department's offering for our respective track in the major, and brought to campus numerous writers to share their poetry and fiction with the VSU community. With his degrees from Humboldt State in California and his PhD from the University of Denver, he certainly had the academic background for such a performance, but Josh had more, both the talent and discipline to build a program while he remained an active poet. In 1996, VSU was able to recruit a worthy colleague for Josh. Jeff Vasseur, a world traveler with an undergraduate degree from Transylvania University in Kentucky and a PhD from the University of Utah, joined the VSU faculty. He brought with him a strong background as both a teacher and administrator, and he and Josh quickly established an admirable rapport and shared commitment to the creative writing program, and most important, to our students. Quite memorable were the two writers' conferences which they organized, received funding to support, and executed with little additional help. For the first time, we had multiple writers together for several days of stimulating panels, individual readings, and informal conversation with students and faculty. What an achievement for them and for Valdosta State. I still remember at the first conference, Bailey White, Janice Doherty, and Morris Smith sharing their national success with their South Georgia neighbors. And at the second, Amy Bloom, Pam Houston, Jim Kilgo, and Ben Ramke, bringing their broad and various experiences to our campus. Those were exciting days. And so it is indeed a special honor for me to introduce both Josh and Jeff to you tonight. Both have had remarkable personal success as writers in just the past year. Josh won the Contemporary Poetry Series competition at the University of Georgia Press in 2001, and his volume, Saunter, has just been published by the Georgia Press. And last summer, Jeff, now an associate professor at VSU, had his short story collection, Discovering the World, published by Mercer University Press. I have heard both of these writers introduce other writers with great eloquence and grace. Because I don't want to take any more of their time, let me just say that in Josh's brief, complex poems, he invites the reader to saunter with him, discovering each individual's place in the world as he or she seeks a place of one's own. In Jeff's stories, the narrator is often an individual remembering how his discovery of the world was always shaped by the individuals who, often quite randomly, entered his life. These narrators must dare to remain open to a multiplicity of experiences, which, while never easy, still transform them through their discovery of self as well as the world around them. Josh and Jeff, I welcome you to Berry College.
I think I need a flat space here. My head might not work. So. You guys are lucky to have such a proponent of contemporary literature here. I think I have to say that too, because the whole time that I was at Valdosta, whenever we had a poet on campus and whenever there was a literary event to be had, if Tom Dasher could be there, he was there. And oftentimes that was above and beyond the call of duty. I don't really know what to read from this book, and I'm not going to read a whole short story, so I thought I would read from the novella, which some of you might know is an unwieldy form. It is unpublishable. It's too long. People talk sometimes about what the novella is, and they disagree about it. I'm not sure I can shed any light on that other than to say that if you think about the classics, The Bear by Faulkner, Death in Venice, and I think Heart of Darkness. I mean, it's almost too short to be a real novel, and it's so perfect that it's got to be closer to its cousins, the short story and poems, that you really find a real devotion to sense of place in these things we call novellas. At any rate, I'm going to read from the novella in my book. That there's one of two stories in the book that draws heavily on Vietnam history. I was talking to Karen, who's a great lover of Latin American literature, and I think that if I learned anything when I really fell in love with Latin American writers, it was the impact of collective history and the weight and importance of not just writing about yourself, but paying attention. And I think ever since September 11th, more Americans are aware of how history does touch us all. Another way of saying this is that I don't know if you're familiar with Philip Roth and Portnoy's Complaint. It's kind of a big book of the 60s, but he wrote about what he wrote about in Portnoy's Complaint. And down in South America, we had these gorgeous, gorgeous collective visions coming out from people like Garcia Marquez and Jose Donoso and Carlos Fuentes. The name of this is Malolo-Lai-Lai, We're Discovering the World. Malolo-Lai-Lai is an island off of Fiji. It's a very unconventional part of this book. I'm from Kentucky and lived there until I was 21, and a lot of the stories are just set in the South, but this one has legs and goes on a trip. I first read it to a very intimidating room of Vietnam veterans who obviously know so much about the war that one should only sometimes just sit and listen. But I fell in love. I think people of our generation, particularly fiction writers, are very much influenced by people like Tim O'Brien and Robert Stone, and if you've read them, you know how important and marvelous they are. I grew up in a situation as the son of a Marine, an ex-Marine, which really left me uninterested in anything having to do with the military. But what I think I'm trying to do in this novella is to remind everybody of the dice roll of history and the aleatory nature of whether or not you get drafted and have to go. It's a story about an absolutely remarkable real man named Robert Fitzgerald. He was a sailboat builder. He spoke a couple of languages, studied mathematics in his spare time, and you'll find out a little bit more about him. The last thing I'll tell you about him is he, after surviving some of the worst parts of the war, had bought a piece of land near Mount Shasta in California, and he pulled over on a Pacific Coast highway to help some people, and was rear-ended by an Allied moving van and crushed in his Datsun pickup. After surviving the war and serving his country, he was killed that way. The name of his boat is, does anybody in the room know the poem A River Merchant's Wife by Ezra Pound? A few people do. It's a lovely poem. I was going to read it, but since we have two readers tonight, I'll just tell you that the name of the boat comes from this beautiful poem by Ezra Pound, and it's a sign of Robert Fitzgerald's class that he thought of this. I'll read one epigraph since we find ourselves in the South. One of the themes of this novella is the 60s in general, rock and roll music. Robert Fitzgerald dated an African-American woman. And here is a quote from Reginald Malloch Edwards. He served in the 9th Regiment of the Marine Corps in Da Nang in 1965. One of the myths about the war is that it was this racial blending, harmonious experience. A lot of people don't know that it wasn't that simple. When Martin Luther King was killed, some Marines in Da Nang wore Confederate flags on their hats and whooped and hollered, and there was a riot, and some servicemen were killed. I'll just read the novella and save the epigraphs for your own delectation. Malala Lili, or Discovering the World. This is a story about one of the most amazing human beings I have ever met. He was someone I had the pleasure of knowing in my slightly wayward youth, a loyal friend and travel companion, someone you could count on whenever the chips were down. We first met in Ventura, California, the rainy spring of 1984, working construction during the day, then later on, as Fitzgerald grew to trust me, after my own loyalty had been eked out and earned, we would talk for hours at the local marina. Robert C. Fitzgerald was an expert sailor and an open water navigator, a carpenter by trade, a plumber and electrician who spoke fluent Spanish plus some fair Italian, a shade tree mechanic and jack of all trades par excellence. He was well traveled, both continental and Pacific Rim, supremely curious, prodigiously busy. He was a 173rd Airborne ex-soldier turned neo-remarque pacifist, a veteran of what he often adamantly referred to as the American War against a diverse geographical and cultural region known as Vietnam. He was DLI trained at Monterey, among other places, so he spoke some Vietnamese as well. He stood 5'7" and weighed around 160. Fitzgerald had this calm but ever attentive, always arresting gaze, brightly colored, inwardly lit gold eyes, very light brown with fleckings of amber. I once found him sitting in his pint-sized Datsun pickup, reading a textbook on calculus, riveted by, zeroing in on it, scratching around in the margins with a chewed-up pencil. "Why in the world are you reading that?" I asked him. "Because I never learned before," Fitzgerald told me. This was his quick, no-frills response. He lived and worked out of that Datsun pickup for years, and slept at night in an 8x6 wooden toolbox he had built near the local marina. This toolbox had been his home for goodness knows how long, just a waterproof wooden box, a poncho liner, and a pillow. He kept a ragged North Face sleeping bag nearby just in case the temperature should drop. Everything else, all of Fitzgerald's books, a few family and combat photographs, select letters, and so forth, he carefully organized and placed in storage. Every spare minute, every spare cent went into his current sailboat in progress, the Chofu Sa. This was one of the sailboats which would change things in ways too complex for me to quickly communicate. It was a 32-foot, exquisitely hand-built beauty which he had skimped and saved for and slowly brought to life. For about 2 years, we remained good friends. Then Robert Fitzgerald turned up dead, so that was that. One day, he was irrevocably gone, thus ending our friendship except for these good memories, thus ending Robert Fitzgerald's quasi-charm geared to his own time life after he had made it through a typhoon off the northeast coast of Australia, another man-killer storm in the Caribbean, and the surreally horrific Battle of Dak To. That's right, November 1967. Of course, if you're a sentient witness of those troubled times and its alchemy of issues, if you're not allergic to history, then perhaps you have an idea about just what this means. That battle, fought for Hill 875, had one of the most tragic instances of friendly fire during our entire involvement. The firefight at Dak To was a pivotal moment for many forever brave and forever dead young men, many so-called theorists of limited war, and dozens of still surviving American soldiers. However, as anyone who actually lived the war knows all too well, any pivotal moment in Vietnam didn't change that much, or change it nearly soon enough. The French had their tragedies at Haiphong, Cai Bao, and Dien Bien Phu, and we learned well from their catastrophes which cut both ways. Next, we had a long list of ours. The battle at Dak To was a turning point in a war replete with so many turning points that they form a monotonous, dizzying gyre. Bien Ho, Ap Bac, Pleiku, Song Bi, the various battles at Hue, and the bad trip standoff at Khe Sanh. Let me be the first to say that I didn't have a blessed clue what Vietnam or any other war was like, and I still don't. I was born in 1960, so I spent the early part of the decade eating Captain Crunch and Pop-Tarts and occasionally peeing in my bed at night. Other things on TV commanded my toddler than my adolescent attention. I ignored the combat footage and stayed glued to Gilligan's Island. I watched Star Trek and Lost in Space from behind my mother's knees while she ironed the family's clothes, getting a cheap rush of outer space danger and scary stuff from between my fingers. Go ahead and laugh. That wavy-armed robot really gave me the willies. By the time I turned 10, other things like riding my SL-70 dirt bike and later on Pac-Man commanded my time. No sir, no ma'am. I didn't have an inkling, not until I hit 23 and ended up in Ventura, where Robert Fitzgerald generally befriended me and taught me some things, partly by putting me in my place. He taught me how to sail and invited me to the South Pacific to help repair a hurricane-damaged boat. He talked to me forthrightly about his combat experience. He really talked, mind you, no holds barred, no swinging dick, tall tales. But this guy was dauntless, I'm telling you. Not nuts or berserk or super macho. He was always thoroughly engaged, no matter what he was doing, and in love with life down to its last drop, fascinated by all of its kaleidoscopic particulars. Once we were at sea in the Fiji Island group when this vicious thunderstorm came out of nowhere, and there we were off Malololai, maybe half a mile from a waterspout, this freaking tornado full of salt water. Well, let me assure you that I was scared and trembling. Yet Robert Fitzgerald was genuinely unafraid, in a wide-awake, stoic, uncocky way which this particular war had taught. And this was the general attitude he had managed to bring back home. And this really salty fish. Robert Carlton Fitzgerald was originally from Fairfield, Connecticut. One of the things that I'm doing in this novella is saying what I want to say about the South. And it's about what we call a Yankee and a Southerner, and other things like what I experienced growing up in Kentucky, which was maybe can be quickly summed up as being closed-mindedness. He was born in 1947 and was an only child. His mother worked as a registered nurse. His father was a dabbler. According to Fitzgerald, his old man was a real piece of work, somewhat of a ne'er-do-well, possibly a genius in his own way. Officially an inventor by trade. Ever known one personally? Someone who makes his living on patents? Well, that's what his father did. Apparently, Robert's childhood was typical enough, fairly comfortable economically, although there were some tight times too. He was publicly educated. His mother and father were both big readers who instilled a lexical appreciation at an early age. Also, they both loved the sea. While he was growing up, Fitzgerald's parents had a Morgan 38, which they kept docked in a rented slip at Stonington, a coastal town in eastern Connecticut with the deep harbor and an open view of the Atlantic. They would go out there most Saturdays, even if it was just to sand or paint something on the sailboat, or generally clean up around the docks. His parents loved each other. They both liked their jobs. His mother worked in the local Catholic hospital, and his father kept his own odd hours. On the weekends, though, ocean winds and swells permitting, the three of them would sail. His mother would pack a picnic lunch with garlic and rosemary roasted chicken, maybe a bottle of chilled Chardonnay. His father would have maybe a few beers tops. He was never a big drinker, according to Fitzgerald, and his son turned out the same. But that didn't always matter, insofar as father could be quite wacky, moody, and unpredictable. I could tell you some of the things he invented: those ceramic fittings for halogen bulbs, a type of backing for adhesive tape, an innovative fiber used in most air conditioning and heating filters. Also, I could tell you about the job he had, working for a company that implanted specks of gamma-sensitive matter inside of skeletons. Sounds wild, right? Maybe so, but no less true. This company in Stamford, Connecticut prepared the skeletons into human facsimiles, then sold them to medical schools to train oncologists and radiologists. The skeletons were real, mind you. They came in burlap bags from Bombay, another hearty gift, if not a gratuity, from the so-called third world to the sunny future of the so-called first. This particular job was only temporary, something Fitzgerald's father did to get the family through a rocky time and allow them to keep their Morgan 38. Since he was between inspirations and patents, he made these training dummies. The bones came into the factory from India, but they had to be reassembled into skeletons because they arrived all loose. Next, they were placed in a person-shaped jello mold, as if the person were laying horizontal. Then the bones were positioned with dabs of clay to hold them away from the lower surface of the mold. This Connecticut company made 90 percentile, 70 percentile, 50 percentile molds, depending on the size of the body desired, male or female, adult or infant. Once the bones had been laid out in this lower mold, a special plastic goo was poured into it that allowed to harden. The assembly was then flipped, clamshelled onto the upper mold, then more of the muscle-like plastic goo was injected. After it was all cured, the body was popped out and unceremoniously sawed crossways, parallel to the ribs, with a meat cutter's bandsaw. The slices were then returned to the mold, stacked back together, then reconnected with plastic registration pins so that they could be held together intact or disassembled one slice at a time. Once they were shipped to the various medical schools, the teacher could hide germanium pellets anywhere in the body, and their students would have the task of finding the offending location using X-ray equipment. Robert Fitzgerald's mother was very devout, Roman Catholic. She worked in the local Catholic hospital's pediatric cardiac ward, having opted to specialize in intensive care, work with children who were struggling to live with their imperfect, variously malformed hearts. Personally, I can't imagine having parents like these, much less growing up with a family sailboat or spending sun-drenched weekends upon the Atlantic Ocean. Robert's father died in a commuter plane crash his senior year in high school, and the year after that, Fitzgerald lost his scholarship to Dartmouth, then joined the Army, then volunteered for paratrooper training. As for myself, I'm from the South. My hometown is a place located near no place at all, but it means a whole lot more than that to me. I was born at a hospital in Paducah, Kentucky, named after the eponymous Indian chief Paducah, who, legend has it, once consorted with Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. George Rogers Clark had been given a land grant for surveying along the Ohio River, and before he died, he willed all of his plotted lands to his brother William Clark, who eventually changed the town's name to from Pekin, Kentucky, to what it is today. We had a small farm and a small house. My father worked incessantly. There were no boats on the coast, no hobbies, no pastimes really. No regular family outings on the weekends with garlic roasted chicken and chilled Chardonnay, but while growing up, that farm Some of the older ways surrounding it was a boyhood paradise. I loved the possibility of the woods. I would go there often with my cousins and my friends. Right now, it seems idyllic. Our home place was an adventure, just waiting for the right gang of boys or girls to make it happen, full of ongoing green spaces, tree houses, sports, and creeks, a pasture for my pony named Candy, who would routinely shit and buck me off in it. She'd also bite me once I was down, covered in talent. There was a nearby gravel pit where I could ride my SL70 motorcycle, no helmet, no shirt, no shoes, just a pair of Levi cutoffs, and that was it. Oh, I was fortunate. Looking back, I wouldn't want my kids to do the same, but all of that wide open, verdant space does something to you, and they haven't got that, or any, as you know, anything close to it over in Paris, London, or Barcelona. All of that freedom, or whatever you want to call it, the wind from a galloping horse against your skin and in your hair, well, it's just something you never forget. My parents were not rich, not even solidly middle class to start with. All we had was all we had, but everything we had seemed like enough. Absolutely fine to me. There were those 70 acres of fescue, a few horses, and that dirt bike. Also, this You Pick 'em strawberry farm, which my friends and I would sneak into at night and then gorge for free. Since I mowed and maintained the owner's lawn all summer, he didn't really mind about all those purloined strawberries. That childhood, that farm, I wouldn't trade it for anything, any other upbringing in this world. My mother didn't work. She stayed at home, cooked and cleaned. Typically Southern, perhaps. Typically 1950s, Ozzie and Harriet. But society was transforming quickly since World War II, changing fairly rapidly for many women in particular. My mother was very pretty, dark black hair, olive skin, hazel eyes. She was attentive and loving, fiercely loyal to her children whenever Daddy's temper got bad. She was a true Christian, the real thing. My mother hated gossips with a passion, and if she didn't have anything kind to say, she would just stay quiet. She was particularly good-hearted if someone had made a mistake in life. Always compassionate, always hospitable, which is still one of the best things about the best people from the South or anywhere else. She loved the so-called unlovables. There was this woman in our vicinity who once set a fire to make some insurance money. She made a very bad mistake, though, and one of her kids was badly burned. Afterwards, everyone shunned the very sight of her, but my mother always tried to speak kindly. That poor, poor woman. Just imagine how she must feel. My mother walked the walk, nothing for show, real WWJD, hard stuff. Perhaps you've seen the slogan and the knickknacks with these letters, which stand for that healthy gadfly reminder, what would Jesus do? Designed for any interpersonal situation. Now, I'm not saying anything about people who are proud of their faith or who announce it on their t-shirts or keychains. What I'm saying has to do with my mother, her depth versus surface approach. My mother was a native of Savannah, Georgia. She came from a more well-heeled, urban, old Southern family. But my father, he was full-fledged country. He'd grown up on that same farm where my brother and sister and I were raised. There were 3 of us siblings total. For the time being, we still have the place. Another traditional family farm swirling down the drain. It's located 2 miles off I-24, 2.5 hours from Nashville, 3 hours from St. Louis. There are a bunch of corporate-owned soybean farms and peach orchard operations all around us. Either them or the home developers are always calling Daddy and cash thirstily waiting in the wings. More than anyone I've ever met, my father took the needs and feelings of others into account. She was a lady who expected me to be a fine young gentleman. She didn't dislike these terms per se, but thought they could definitely be misnomers. Evidently, there were a lot of so-called ladies and gentlemen in the world. people who were really what my Aunt June called snooty toots. Fashionable folks who cared more for their cars and clothes, their country clubs and social ranking, than being well-spoken, graceful, and gracious to other people. We had a few relatives, for example, a couple of cousins who lived in Baltimore, Maryland. They were actually native Louisvillians, though, with heyday Brown and Williamson tobacco stock, some thoroughbred horse money, and their bluegrass pasts. Not exactly embodiments of noblesse oblige. They sometimes made fun of their country cousins' accents and seemed full of metropolitan prejudice in various ways. Do they think the people in the Bronx sound mellifluous? Oh, there's many flavors of provincialism, don't you think? One of these cousins even has an Ivy League education, but on the subjects of poverty and crime in inner city America, I've sure heard some callous things come out of his Paleolithic mouth. To this day, I still can't help but feel that there's something off-kilter and ungrateful, something unimaginative about how he sees things. Thank you very much.
For giving me the opportunity to do this. Very grateful for Tom for supporting her and making that possible as well. It's such a great pleasure to read in Georgia, where the majority of these poems were written, and also a great pleasure to hear my good buddy Jeff read from his fine book that has been so well earned. This is a strange business, publishing. I just got the happy news today that some of you may be students of Dr. Meeks, and she has a full-length collection of poetry due out in April. Another tremendous writer who I respect greatly. This particular book, it took 10 years to get a book, and so it is somewhat thrilling to read, and somewhat anticlimactic as well. I want to read a few epigraphs here because epigraphs should be chosen, I believe, to do work in a text, and maybe by reading some of the epigraphs I can do away with some anecdotes to precede the poems. But I will say one thing about poetry as I see it, and that is, bottom line, one way or another, all poems are about language itself. So while my themes may sometimes seem slightly metaphysical or esoteric, the nexus between nature, language, and spirituality is what has interested me and what sustained this particular collection. The first epigraph is from a wonderful essay by Henry David Thoreau titled Walking. He gives the etymology for the word saunter, which is the title of this collection. This is not the word's true etymology. This is Thoreau being playful and inventive. He says, I have met with but one or two persons in the course of my life who understood the art of walking, that is, of taking walks, who had a genius, so to speak, for sauntering, which word is beautifully derived, quote, from idle people who roved about the country in the Middle Ages and asked charity under pretense of going à la santerre, to the Holy Land, till the children exclaimed, there goes a saunterer, a Holy Lander. They who never go to the Holy Land in their walks, as they pretend, are indeed mere idlers and vagabonds. But they who do go there are saunterers in the good sense, such as I mean. Some, however, would derive the word from sans terre, without land or a home, which therefore, in the good sense, will mean having no particular home, but equally at home everywhere. For this is the secret of successful sauntering. The title of this poem is An Opening. Subject to vertigo, mountains swoon. To break the cold, a page whitens its raw material thicket ecstatically still. Sheltered in absence, geese wedge their script. In thinnest air, a cello scales some stairs. Risen, A thought falls. Yet an opening remains, trembling in the same continuous day of the mountains. Keep track of time. Well, we ran for 35 minutes today. Optique. No, I'll skip that one. Askance. Jeff and I have been having a debate about how this word is pronounced. Is it askance? Is it askance? I always said askance, but I don't know. I'll say that again, askance. The rain is smashed. Its modest revolt weighs nothing. In aftermath, we rehearse serenity. Its violence held in words worth repeating. Do not believe it. The drama of the familiar world was never possible. Penitence crushes the mountain, and labor does not aspire. Mercy. Faster in reverse. The wind across this lake begins a drowning. A new grammar suffers its inception. Commands in questions. Fish that flexes in the hand holds the delicate body of prayer. What can we do with it? This fresher light of shipwrecked eyes. It is a reflection where I have come silent at its edge to cast a stone. I'm going to read now from the middle section of the book that has an epigraph from the sculptor and artist Robert Smithson. It is the dimension of absence that remains to be found. The title of this poem, this is a title poem for the section. It's called Traces, and it's in 4 parts. 1. On the train, you reread chapters of the surrogate novel discarded at the station. It had been raining all day, and when you returned home, the sidewalk was scoured of the victim's outline. Behind bolted doors, neighbors squinted at the instances offered, as through a peephole in a public restroom, opening its intimate promise on a similar compartment, its signatures and calligrams scrawled and gouged in the city's desperate margins. So it is with the transient landscapes of the motel, the inn, the motor lodge, dear to us for their presence, absent as it is, the gilt-framed Alps, the palms surprising the peninsula at dawn. They don't dare coincide. In some available scrutiny, the least things wait for the imitations to end. 2. I knew a woman who had a man's name written on her thigh. I read it there and felt a sudden happiness as if the future had unglimpsed itself in a rustle of maps unrolling. The sky went slowly deaf, and on the radio the popular song squared itself and vanished. Later, driving home, I nearly died, hands unfettered from the wheel, a cicada chirping in the car. I was wondering from what place I might speak and go unheard, from what small scope squeak. Instead of music or ledgers, a kind of uninvented snow, or a burnished desert disguised as a garden. 2 serenities. Among our provisions, the finest sadnesses, as if payment for our passage. And then I thought of you, at no distance, placing the small new voweled mouth behind bars, absurd tender. 3. On the bus you reread chapters from the romance abandoned in the terminal. The day's slack attention festers as minutes and buildings smear past, hammock vines strangling their host trees. The pages lie in your hand, open and unable to rise, your eyes still unbroken. Against the window, the horizon gets up, looms over the tarred roof of the abattoir. Afternoon is a nosebleed. The fabulous domestic takes you into its mouth. Somewhere someone is painting a name beneath a bridge. Water is cool there. In the black and white movie on a small screen in a trailer on the outskirts of town, the moon rises red. 4. In a field, I found a child's balloon, withered by its lostness, tether attached. The tears of its parting were forgotten, are forgotten, even as it wobbles up over the heat of carnival lights and the wheezy music, above the screams, the spinning machines, dismantled, loaded onto trucks at week's end when the caravan leaves for a similar city. Where we are going, we are already old, and carnivals close the streets. The abeyance between notes is filled with the smell of tires burning. The reliquary stuffed with photos was forgotten in the portable toilet. Nostalgia left yesterday with its accordion. Hurry! The tourist bus is departing for the temple. We cannot think of dying. We stand at the base of tall strangers. We move, and out of this we come to the world again. No picture to replace it. Like many teachers, I teach and have taught for many, many years composition. And in some ways, this next poem owes its existence to that experience. I was reading an essay one day and I came to a word and I couldn't tell the tense of the word based on its context. I had to read to the end of the sentence. There was this moment of wonderful potential in this word at that time. This can be a sanity-saving virtue if you read student papers. The word was read, or read, R-E-A-D. That is the title of this poem, and the tense is intentionally ambiguous. It has a quote in the middle from the writer Frederick Douglass. Some of you may have read The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, Runaway Slave, written by himself. There's that wonderful moment where he's teaching himself to read on the sly, sort of by bribing the white neighborhood children. And he reached a point of facility where he can read the newspaper, and he comes across the word abolitionist. He doesn't know what it means. And he looks it up in the dictionary, and he finds that it means, the act of abolishing, but he doesn't know what is to be abolished. He finds out later, of course, fortunately. There are many kinds of thraldom and many kinds of indenture, and I think that language is often subjected to it. And that's what this poem deals with. Waiting for the end of the indeterminate now, where context becomes clear. As if to peel the day from the desk calendar prematurely were a kind of curse. Worms in a can, fish in a kettle. Here I was perplexed, wrote Frederick Douglass. I found it was the act of abolishing, but I did not know what was to be abolished. Perplexed, a child picks the scab from a wound where years later he will finger a scar, the body's braille, committed to the memory of what it meant in the absence of service. The word alone, imperative perhaps, or adrift without cargo, a silence inconsolable. I'll read some from the final section. And this is called batten, a word which, again, I encountered one day, a word that I'd heard. It's common usage as in batten down the hatches. Not that I'm a nautical man, but that means, of course, to fix, as in to tighten down, but batten can also mean to fatten or increase. And this duality was fascinating to me, and it's just a fun word to say, batten. The epigraph comes from Helen Keller, person that you may be familiar with. She has a wonderful essay called "Everything Had a Name." And words as names for things is also something that fascinates me. And the way that the connection between knowledge and language and experience. And I'll let the epigraph do the rest of the speaking. This comes right after she's made a great progress in learning how to understand language and names for things. She writes, "I left the well house eager to learn. Everything had a name, and each name gave birth to a new thought. As we returned to the house, every object which I touched seemed to quiver with life. That was because I saw everything with a strange new sight that had come to me. On entering the door, I remembered the doll I had broken. I felt my way to the hearth and picked up the pieces. I tried vainly to put them together. Then my eyes filled with tears, for I realized what I had done, and for the first time, I felt repentance and sorrow." These are simply numbered. There are 35 of them. I'll just read a smattering. This is the first one. "Wafer thin, the morning's green amnesia breaks against waking, more oblivious than sleep. A brief sense of being lost, then night resumes. There is a space that takes to living so beautiful you can weep your eyes blue, find fragments short tight against a vaulted sky. The slightest crack and it comes down. Oh, intricate heap of language now waked, lazy, alert, a fright, I fell through the word wood pressed back, dark white." This is number 8. "And I kept not my mouth with a bridle, and the world fled before me out of sight. And unto me it came, again transformed, and I established not my path idle. I went, and the way was dark with light, that bent above the days, as words new shorn will heap up as sound. Crash down and free all those who are as strangers, bound outright, heed danger signs. To point away, to mourn is vain. A thing that has to will to be is born." I should probably mention that these poems, there's a good deal of rhyme and what Hopkins called sprung rhythm in them, a preponderance of strong accents, number of spondees. This is actually a form that he developed. This is Gerard Manley Hopkins, the Victorian poet. He called it a kirtle or bobtail sonnet. It's not 14 lines long, it's only 11. And the final line is composed of a single iambic word or phrase. So you may hear that. I've enacted certain violence upon them so that they're fractured. You can actually, it was my intention that you could read them 3 ways, as columns or individual poems and left to right, which is how I'll be reading them. This is number 14. "I will lift up my hands in the same name, the right, the left, the bands of vein and blood, and tear what warp or weft still cleaves my tongue to shame. I will be next in the next, a flame sharp as leaves of speech. The face in the hood shall not be mine. The line that grieves for young days lost will loop and find that it is gone, that where truth stood once, there is a flood of noise. White, stray past this place, that sprung now has no guilt, no grace, no edge but one, a song." Number 23, which is for my son, Phelan. When he was small, he used to put his hands in his plate, empty or full, and say, "Look, spiders, spiders." Your hands, twin spiders, scamper from the plate where landscapes slide together on a fault your mind pries open to release the dove below the tiny house. You must create the cat's rush uncoiled from a bush. You exalt the beetle and the worm, all lives that move beneath the surface. Still, your will to rage is blurred, so that the words you make are caught by surprise, shaken loose from the need to prove such things as age, the whiteness of a page, or love. I'll read the last two, 34 and 35. I had some of these poems rejected by an editor, and why was that actually? He said something about, I think he said something about wanting a narrative, so I wrote one in the more narrative vein near the end. It was good to hear from you, and I thought of that time near the wood when we saw the bright flash of a bird part the green wall of that world. It burned the sight, yes. Our eyes closed as it flew straight at us. We were three live things then. And when we looked once more, keen to see where it had gone, one of us never should have tried to guess its name. Suddenly, it was a word much less than it had been. Your mouth was the cruelest hue I had ever seen. A carelessness sufficient to the day ransacks the trees. Sound comes of no source, forces the bloody cracks in the eye, grown fat with sight, to tremble. Out of air, flayed down to acrobatic glee. A swallow's course in flight is vatic, free. Where it is at any point cannot be made to break, off course. There was no call for remorse, for falling up. I forgot the way back, and yet I felt remorse. What do you make of that? I'd like to finish off now with some newer California poems as opposed to Georgia poems, composed in California anyway. This one, Jeff's wonderful novella, the narrator's discussion of his father reminded me a little bit of this poem. And I think our fathers are probably somewhat similar. This is a somewhat autobiographical poem called Happy. The boy looks up from his army men on the floor before the couch. He is happy. Used toys, beat up, scored with teeth marks from some other kid, but his now. Above him his parents sit, his father reading, always reading, his mother mending another kid's shirt, but his now. Come Monday he will wear it to school. His mother smiles, looks at his father. The needle glides mid-stitch through air, hovers an inch above his father's thigh. The boy watches his father reading, his mother smiling. The needle moves closer, his mother's hand, his father's thigh. The needle's point gone somewhere through his blue jeans. The boy's mother watches his father's face, reading. The boy watches the mother's hand, her fingers pinch, the needle goes deeper. Then the man looks up slow from the book, slow. The boy cannot move. He hopes the man will not be mad. He hasn't flinched or spoken. Then the man looks at the woman hard. The man says, "Are you happy now?" The woman looks to her hand, her fingers white, holding the needle. She pulls it out. "Oh, sweetheart," she says, "you didn't move. I thought you didn't feel nothing," she says. She is crying now. "I thought you was..." This next poem shows what a little botanical knowledge can do, for good or ill. Some of you may be familiar with Luke 19:6, this story of Zacchaeus in the Bible, who climbed into the fig tree to see Christ as he passed. There's even a little, as I recall, a little Sunday school ditty about Zacchaeus, wee little man. He was known to be short of stature, wee little man who climbed up in the tree to see what he could see. It's an interesting passage. Zacchaeus was, I believe, a tax collector. He was not well liked by the people. And much is made by ministers of Christ's command for him to descend from the tree, come down. Christ said, I'm going to go to your house. And the people are astonished. Why is he going to hang out with Zacchaeus? He's a jerk. And off they go. And they have some discussions, and Zacchaeus says, I'll be sure to give half of what I make to the poor, and so on and so forth. And then you never hear about Zacchaeus again. Christ launches into a parable, and that's the end of the story. The title of this poem is Come Down. Everyone I've ever heard elaborate on that passage talks about the sternness of the command. He doesn't say, "Please come down, Zacchaeus." He says, "Come down." The epigraph is from Luke 19:6. "And he made haste and came down and received him joyfully." Come down. The sycamore of the Bible is a kind of fig tree, Ficus sycamorus. And into such a tree Zacchaeus climbed to gain a truer vantage as Christ passed. Or so the story goes. How can we know intent after the fact? Disparate causes may lead to the same act, and effects grow more miraculous each time the teller pauses. Perhaps an earthly hunger drove his ascent to scrabble for fruit beyond his reach. After all, climbing was not new to him. A small man, Zacchaeus had proven himself in a world of taller men. He was a chief whose wealth increased his stature, proving once again that providence can raise the shrewd and dwarf the less industrious. Why pay for figs when they were near at hand? The Lord helps those who help themselves. Besides, he liked to be above the press of rubbernecking zealots on the road. Consider how Christ must have felt when he glanced up into the glare and saw Zacchaeus cradled in that tree, a man who did not give a fig for those who stood there in the dust below. Much has been made of Christ's command, which was by most accounts direct. One wonders what his tone revealed. A momentary lapse, perhaps, by one who hoped to make a point. It's likely that Zacchaeus understood such parlance, so vital in his line of work. He was a man whose station could accommodate a certain grace because his own commands were not to be ignored. The subtleties of saving face sometimes demand that one become a host, and so, smiling, he saw the task at hand, to descend and have some commerce with the man. The title for this next poem and the poem itself arose from the etymology of the title, which is columbine. If you're familiar with the flower, it's thought, or was thought, that inverted the blossom bore resemblance to a cluster of doves. It's also the root from which we get the term columbarium, which is just another term for a mausoleum. And of course now this term is etched in our collective consciousness in a much more unfortunate way. Columbine. its blossoms inverted, a cluster of doves. The hope that describing be an act, yet after the fact the unbearable entropy of description. To speak this powerlessness, this lack in such a way to change the faces that come back and back and back again with our fatigue, the way names blur together. Some birds become a bloom, a place, an event repeating its loss. Time goes on. We carve the stone of empty space, and though we try to catch its voice, perhaps all we reclaim is a little room in which to live. I live about a stone's throw from the American River, and in the fall, the Chinook salmon, also known as king salmon, run to spawn, and they die by the droves. The fishermen are lined up, and you know, if you've ever seen a salmon that's come up to spawn, they're usually in pretty bad shape. They're beat up, and all sorts of fish ick on them, and you know, white gashes, and it's just amazing to watch the tenacity and the instinctual drive of those creatures as they come to spawn. The title of this poem is In Earnest, and it has to do with the spawning of the king salmon in the American River. Fall's gold is gone. The American will reek another week or two before the circling birds stop dropping black along the river's edge to feed upon the rotting fish. One marks this season by the stench of kings. Some picked to bones, some bloated in the watery sun, some carried home by fishermen. A couple's lab has slipped its leash. It runs and will not be called back until it rolls in what remains, to mask its scent in throes of primal joy. A pack of boys cast stones at one that offers now as evidence its last thrashing in the shallows near the shore. I leave my footprints with the rest. Along this edge, death is success, and its resolve to live nowhere in earnest, now here in every phase, is almost nothing, almost all. I'll read two more. One of the reasons we left South Georgia and moved back to California was to be near family. My wife's whole family lives in the area where we now reside, but sadly, her mother died last March, and she was an amazing woman. She was only 67, quite intrepid and independent. She thought nothing of hopping in her pickup with her dog and driving from California to Valdosta for the birth of our two children. It's a long story, but she died of diabetes-related complications, poor vascularization in her legs, which led to gangrenous toes, amputations. Finally, she decided she didn't want to continue. She made the choice to refuse treatment, whereupon she went septic and died very shortly thereafter. The title of this poem is In Extremity. The eyes wrung dry, and yet, just here, beyond the glass, these hummingbirds, aloof, they draw the sweetness from the blooms. Beyond cafeteria walls, a concrete quad in which we eat spring sun between each watch. Beyond those all in white, who come and go, they draw the fluid from her lungs. There is a point we touch and do not near. And I approached, and hollowly I spoke my truth, that in my garden I found a sharp-tailed snake beneath a stone, a black stone in my garden, which is my garden, that I do not own the snake, Contia tenuis, which I named and held yet could not hold. my eyes, the world had drawn them dry. This lame, this useless, I am made to love the crawling and the winged, their furious hearts, their throats aflame, her black toes. We had Jeff has a theory that I think is probably dead on. That being a parent makes you a better writer. So I said I would end with a parental poem, and I shall do so. Thank you very much for attending. You've been a delightful audience. This poem is called The Dark. The fleshy veneer of books and boyhood retreats in the nightlight's glow. Every father knows that when he rises, rolling back the sheet and stumbling down the hall, the fear that goes before him is his own. What if there is no one in the bed, the imprint of a small body merely, and no sun? Yet that absence is gone as soon as the child begs comfort, and he, the bringer of all good things, dispels with words what was not there, and slakes the thirst and lies back down to sleep. And then, assured once more that one will mourn him when he dies, he sighs, closes his eyes, and asks for the sake of one beside him in the dark, "Are you awake?" Thank you very much. I think Jeff and I both be happy to chat or sign books if you have time.
There are books on sale up front, so if you're interested.
No, it's not.